to today's edition of Pegasus Test. On today's edition, I have Ian McCollum from Forgotten Weapons here, and we have just yomped across East Falkland, recreating the route that 4-5 Commando took from Port San Carlos into Stanley during the Falklands War. And along the way, we've talked a lot of military history and tactics and techniques used by both the Argentines and the British. And we've been educating Ian on a lot of military matters, and he's got a lot of specific questions. So we thought we'd have this quick video to go over those questions because we figured probably a lot of you have them as well.
Yeah, so when we set up to come down here, I did a fair amount of reading about the war. And one of the things I really specifically wanted to do was come in here with an open-minded, an equal opportunity approach. I don't want to fall victim to, there's a popular conception that, oh, this was just a complete walkover. The British were going to come down here and obliterate the Argentines. And I wanted to give the Argentines the benefit of the doubt, figure out, okay, what did each side do right and wrong? And being able to see the battlefields in some ways kind of changed that for me. So in particular, aside from walking through around a bunch of the hill positions, we specifically went up Mount Harriet. And we took a bunch of time on Mount Harriet. The first thing that we all noticed is that the British line of departure for the attack on Mount Harriet, the point where they actually started the attack, was halfway up the approach slope to the mountain already.
Utterly amazing.
We had seen this site on the bus when we first arrived coming out of Mount Pleasant, and you and Yari were both talking about it. You're like, oh, so the book says the approach, the line of departure was the fence, but it can't be that fence, that's way too close.
Yeah, it's got to be one over there, maybe the one behind it.
But it was that fence, right there. You're already going up the base of the hill. And we get up to these positions, and you're looking at some of these Argentine positions, and you're like, holy crap, give me an FN mag, and I'll die of old age up here. No one's ever getting me out of these positions, and yet, not only does Mount Harriet fall in one night's fighting, every single one of these hill positions falls in a single night and then a few hours into the morning. What it's curious to me, what was it that gave the British the ability to take these positions that seem to be such incredibly good defensive positions, and in situations where they're actually almost always outnumbered by Argentine defenders? That shouldn't happen.
No, textbook-wise, you should have a 3-to-1 advantage over the person you're attacking. The British at best had 1-to-1 parity.
Yeah.
Usually they were outnumbered. This comes to what a lot of the books, Thompson and Moore, refer to as moral dominance. They dominated their enemy right from the beginning, set the tone of the battle, and it carried through. And one of the things that 42 Commando did, in particular, when they got into position on Mount Kent and later they moved over to Mount Challenger, is they aggressively patrolled their area. And what they found in their aggressive patrolling was the enemy's not doing the same.
Okay.
The enemy's putting out some minefields, but they watched them put the minefields out, so they knew where they were at. So that dictated their course of action. And they slowly started to realize as they aggressively patrolled, they're focusing on one area, and they're patrolling, they kept finding there's gaps, that there's no coverage, and they patrolled so well, they figured out, hey, we could have our start line really, really close to the objective, which in this case was really important because that hill is very steep. By the time we went up to Harriet, we'd had 2 or 3 days rest from the yomp, and it was still winding you out, and we weren't carrying weapons, we weren't carrying 782 gear or packs or anything. And they found the right place to start. They figured out from the Argentine defenses that they were in the Argentines' dead space. So from that start line till almost, I'd say about 80, 70 meters from the first Argentine positions, it's all dead space. The Argentines wouldn't have seen them, which then goes to show the next problem is the Argentines were incredibly poorly led. The Argentine army at that time did not have an NCO corps, and it shows.
Okay.
When we're up on the mountain, the positions are there, and somebody's, I've piled some rocks up. Yes, I've run some wires to my command post, and apparently they did nothing else.
It certainly didn't look like it, and we don't see any record of other defensive preparations in any of the books.
Yeah, they clearly didn't put out their wire mine obstacles, which is really weird because we know the Argentines had tons of mines. It took them 30 years down here to clean them all up. They may or may not have had wire, but they could have put up some type of obstacles that would have slowed 4-2 Commando down and force them into other areas that the Argentines would have prepared kill boxes.
It seems to me, like looking at the terrain out here, it is flat. On the hills, there's like tactical cover. You know, there are rocks that one guy can hide behind this rock and one guy can hide behind that rock. But there's not much more than that. And once you're off of the hill, there's like nothing to take cover behind. It's just flat peat. And you know, I've seen war movies. The guys are trying to sneak up on the enemy position, and one of them trips over a wire, and cans jingle, or a flare goes up. Like, if they'd had flares and just a low hidden wire and some trip flares, it would have been an absolute massacre of British troops trying to approach up the base of this mountain before they get to any of the meager cover that there is.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And when we got to the top of Harriet, we did find that one position where the 50 cal mountain is still there. It could have been traversed into that dead space and it would have destroyed them, which also goes to the lack of NCOs, because there was clearly no discipline going on. Their watch shifts were not doing their job. It appears from all the historical records that the Argentines were just left out on those hills, so they weren't well prepared to be out in there. They apparently weren't very well fed, so by that point of the war, I think they just didn't care, and they weren't doing their watch rotations, because if you had anybody semi-alert, they would have seen the British coming.
You'd think so. So, like, one concession to the Argentines, like, I can't imagine being one of the Argentine conscripts stuck out on those hills. It would be freezing cold. They were up there for probably not the entire period of the war, but they would have been up there for at least a month.
At a minimum.
In basically a little scraped trench with insufficient rations not being provided, watching the officers come out, inspect the positions, and then scoot off back to some confiscated civilian house in Stanley to eat the good food.
Yeah.
Like, I can't, obviously they had to be horribly badly motivated, demoralized by that point.
Oh yeah, and you can just tell, because they're not doing the most basic thing in a defensive position: always improve your lot in life. You know, just like in life, you work to get a better job, a better house, a better car. You always make your position better. We can clearly see here, after 42 years, all the work they did in a day, and then they just sat and did nothing.
The other thing we saw is that there didn't seem to be much depth to the positions. There would be basically like a row of emplacements, of holes, you know, bits of rock that had been sort of built up, areas that had been dug out and covered with a little bit of sheet metal and some turf. But it was a pretty narrow band of fighting positions.
Yeah, that is kind of an effect of terrain. They expected the British come from due west. So if you come due west up Mount Harriet, you would go into a series of positions.
Okay.
But also, that's not a great plan, because they'd have one or two Argentine positions facing the British at one time that would have their full force coming. So those would have been overwhelmed in turn. The British would have paid a high price, but it still would have worked. When you come from the flank like Fort 2 did, they hit towards the rear of the position. The positions the Argentine had were not orientated in that direction, so they had a bit of an easier time rolling those up, and they just rolled it up in reverse instead.
Okay. So if you had been tasked with the defense of one of these mountain hills outside of Stanley, you would have had much more aggressive patrolling to prevent the enemy from getting close, and to keep a knowledge of where they are and when they're moving. You would have had out a front line of claymores, trip flares.
Oh my God, yes.
Things to alert you when the enemy approaches, and to funnel and direct enemy movement. What else would you have done differently on that battlefield?
The top of the hill of Mount Harriet I would have used as my final lead out, my Alamo per se, but I would have pushed units about a third of the way down to the hill.
Okay.
Because there was plenty of rocks down that far that would have given the position depth. You would have had the upper levels able to cover over it. The lower positions would have seen the British much earlier. The British would have been forced to push out their line of departure much farther, which would have given them a much longer line of approach, which would have used up more nighttime attack time. So,
and it would have put them in an area with even less cover, where they have to go to ground to fight those first line of positions, and they can be hit from like above,
right,
by fire coming down from the top of the mountain.
By having my regular riflemen down earlier, maybe with a mag or two, that would have opened up. But then the 50s that they had, and they had plenty of them because there's still a lot of positions up there. That could have just been raining hellfire and damnation down on them, because we all know when Mama Deuce and the 50 cal sing, everybody listens. So yeah, this hill was given up entirely too easy, and the battle was essentially lost before it began.
And they all were kind of like that. Some of the hills were harder taken than others, but they all seem to suffer from these same fundamental problems.
Yeah, it's just a lack of good sergeants at the time. I believe the Argentines have corrected that in the modern day, but in 1982, there were no NCOs out there standing on the troops saying, hey, go improve this position, get that, go out and patrol, do all these different things. That just did not happen.
And I would think the sergeants would also have a significant role in not just driving the troops to do better stuff, but also supporting them, making sure that rations come out and get issued, making sure that guys get rotated out of those positions.
Yeah, one of the stories we found about Mount Harriet was they were under direct observation by the Mountain and Arctic Warfare cadre from Goat Ridge, which, when you're standing on Harriet, Goat Ridge has a perfect view.
And it's not very far away. It's like, 800 meters away?
Yeah,
it's
it's
right
on
there.
at most. And they figured out right before the battle where the Argentines had their field kitchen set up. So they called fire on it. And the Argentines set the field kitchen up in the exact same spot the next day. So that force on that hill was pretty heavily attrited before 4-2 Commando hit it, which that's another part of shaping your battle space. And the Argentines could have done a lot to prevent that.
Even just that patrolling you talked about earlier would have prevented SAS or SBS from setting up observations so close as on Goat Ridge.
Oh yeah, because another thing you see when you're standing out there, Two Sisters to the north of it is not terribly far away. It's in 50 cal range for sure. Goat Ridge is right between the two. Between the two Argentine units on each feature, just turns patrolling Goat Ridge would have prevented that.
Yeah. On a more operational level, one of the things the Argentines did was essentially they conceded the entirety of the islands except the area around Stanley once the British started landing in the west at Port San Carlos. Do you think that was a justifiable move, or should they have done something different? Did they have a way to really try to rebuff the British landings once they'd started? If we assume that the Air Force is out of the picture here, the Air Force isn't able to effectively interdict the landing itself, should the Army have tried to do something there?
The Army definitely should have. If nothing else, basic harassment. I can understand where the Argentines might not have been willing to risk their helicopters under Harriers overhead to fly out to San Carlos. It's a judgment call for sure. But they could have sent out small raiding parties, just constant harass on the British, because the British are getting bombed. They can only unload at night. During the day, they're trying to sort out what they unloaded during the night, because it was just take it off the ship and get it off, figure it out later. And then all of a sudden, taking indirect fire, taking little raids and all that, that would have forced the British to stop what they're doing. That would have forced them to patrol more aggressively around Port San Carlos, which would have just eaten up time. It would have given the Argentine Air Force more time to work on the British at San Carlos. So that really comes down to Menendez just being not a good general.
And that yomp that we did was completely uncontested. The British had recce parties out in front, and there were one or two little engagements like Mallow House.
Yeah.
But 99%, the British just packed up and walked all the way across the island without ever getting a bullet fired in their direction.
That's where a lot of credit goes to the British, because one, their aggressive patrolling, the Arctic Warfare cadre was out there, SBS was out there, SAS was out there, the Paras had their patrol companies far out in front of them. So they're out in front trying to find that, so if an enemy force is coming, the main body has time to prepare for it. The other thing was, at this time, the air battles are significant. While the yomp's going on, Goose Green's going on. So both sides are focusing their attention at Goose Green. The Argentine Air Force is still focused on San Carlos. It does rest on its laurels a little bit, because by the time the yomps started, they've sunk Sheffield, they've sunk Coventry, they've sunk Ardent, they've sunk Antelope. The Atlantic conveyor's gone down. And thanks to the BBC, the Argentines know that all the helicopters are gone, all the tentage is gone, a lot of the supplies are gone. So while I don't think Menendez was a good general, the just sit and wait it out strategy does have some merits to it.
Okay. But it could have been a sit and wait it out while putting out delaying actions to harass
absolutely.
and slow down the British. Like, if you wanted to base your defense on the idea of, if we can last long enough, the British public will lose taste for war, the Royal Navy will run out of their ships will get to the point that they're in such poor condition they have to return to England. All of these things were legitimate risks for the British force. But if you're Argentina and that's your main plan, it would really behoove you to come up with some ways to delay the British and extend that timeline as much as possible.
Not moving their artillery forward, it was a major, major mistake. They left it on what's basically called Stanley Common, which is the area just south of Stanley, some flat land. That's where most of their artillery was concentrated. So the hills were at their outer limits of their 105s, and their 155s could go a little bit further, almost to Estancia. They didn't move that up and had their own patrols out. They would have known where the British at, and they could have bombarded them.
Like at Estancia, they set up an HQ and a medical infrastructure that could have come under indirect artillery fire.
Oh, yeah.
And that really would have messed up some of the British plans.
And the incredible nice people, Tony and Ilsa, out there at Estancia, who showed us all around, was pointing out that there are artillery impacts from the Argentines just a hill over.
Yeah.
And if the Argentines were getting that far from south of Stanley, man, moving up into the valley between Longden and Two Sisters we walked through, they could have bombarded Estancia out of existence.
And they're also at Estancia talking about, and the British used that field to base helicopters, and they had their HQ section over here, and all of that could have been targeted and bombarded.
And that's another thing too. We saw the defensive positions on Harriet, and we saw the Perez defensive positions they built on the hill right across from Estancia. The British ones, who knew they weren't going to be there long, were way better constructed.
They were.
It is almost a textbook position for a lazy W. Some positions forward, some back in a W pattern. So everybody had interlocking fire. They were almost built to a regulation. They were built to a certain standard. You wouldn't get me out of those positions either.
Yeah. The Argentine positions were much more like, I'm out hiking and I have to shelter myself overnight. What can I throw together with scraping a little hole and piling up some rocks?
Yeah, they were more windbreaks than defensive positions.
And most of them were like the size of a sleeping bag.
Yeah.
Like, you're not organizing stuff in there. You don't have a two-man buddy team in that position. You got one dude who's shivering his ass off.
Yeah. And the other thing is we found several holes up on Mount Harriet where clearly people went down. We found remnants of sleeping bags in them. And if that was a meter or two from their fighting position, like, okay, the guys are swapping out. But we didn't see that. There seemed to be no correlation between where they were sleeping and where they had a fighting position established.
From the reports I read of the British taking the hills, those sleeping positions were the fighting positions. Because they talk about running into Argentine soldiers who were just curled up in their sleeping bags. Like, head in the sand, we're going to make this go away and just pretend it doesn't exist. This is awful.
Yeah. Which, again, just shows poor leadership.
Yeah.
Because to contrast with the British, who had excellent leadership, they marched across the they were in fighting order. The horrible stories that Ilsa and Tony told us at Estancia about some paratroopers having to be carried in on chairs to have their feet treated, yet they were able to completely get themselves organized and conduct attacks up Mount Longden.
Yeah, within a week.
Yeah. So the Argentines had lost the battle before it began.
Yeah, and it was really enlightening to see that firsthand and really get an understanding of, oh wow, this is in fact this is a situation, this is how it happened.
There's an old axiom that says, mediocre soldiers with excellent weapons will lose to excellent soldiers with mediocre weapons every time. Basically, that played out here.
Yeah, except that
the
both
weapons
sides
were all
exactly
the same thing.
weapons.
Yeah. But it just proved the British were just better soldiers.
Yeah.
All right. Got any other questions yet?
I don't think so.
Cool.
It was a really fun time. I appreciate you coming up with this idea for us to come out and do this crazy nonsense.
It was crazy, but it's definitely glad we did it.
Yeah, me too.
We hope you found this helpful and informative. Please comment, like, and subscribe. And tune in for future interviews on Pegasus Test.